The morning light filtered through the pergola Marcus had built 3 summers ago, catching the dew that clung to the leaves of his prize-winning heirloom tomatoes. He moved through the garden with the careful attention of a man who loved something more than most people loved other people. At 56 years old, with a 40-year mortgage nearly paid and no one depending on him, Marcus had discovered that a garden could be a religion. The soil was his scripture, the seasons his sacrament. His property was a corner lot on Oakwood Drive, a quiet street in suburban Pennsylvania where the houses sat on generous plots and the neighbors mostly kept to themselves. The front was landscaped with native plantings and flowering perennials, hostas, daylilies, astilbe, but the real masterpiece was the back. Behind the privacy fence that Marcus had reinforced and sealed 3 years ago, there existed a kingdom of green. Raised beds in 4 geometric rows held vegetables organized by season. The tomatoes, his obsession, came in 23 varieties. There were heirlooms from seeds his mother had given him before she passed. Brandywines that grew fat as softballs, Cherokee purples with their distinctive ribs, tiny golden sungolds that burst with concentrated sweetness. He'd won local agricultural awards for his soil composition and pest management techniques. Garden clubs requested tour. The herbs grew in a tiered section near the kitchen door, basil and oregano in summer, rosemary and thyme year-round. He sold surplus tomatoes and vegetables at the farmer's market twice a week, a ritual that had become the structure of his life. Tuesday and Saturday mornings, 6 a.m. to noon. The regulars knew him, saved his best tomatoes, asked about his winter plans. It was a Tuesday in late June when Marcus first noticed something was wrong. He came out to water at dawn, as he did every morning, and saw the depression in the soil near the fence. A footprint, very small, child-sized. His heart did something strange, a flutter of concern that surprised him with its intensity. He inspected the fence carefully. The boards on the far side showed recent weathering where something had scraped the paint. The latch on the gate he always locked, was undisturbed, but along the lower corner of the fence, where 2 sections met, he could see where the wood had been weakened by previous pressure. Someone had been pushing through here. Marcus reinforced the section that morning, driving new posts deep and doubling the bracket work. He was thorough. He was always thorough. That was the quality that had made him an excellent accountant for 40 years and an even better gardener. Details mattered. Systems prevented catastrophe. He thought about it for 3 days, the small footprint, the attempted fence breach, but nothing else happened. The garden remained pristine. He watered, he pruned, he misted the seedlings. He found a 4-leaf clover near the pathstone and photographed it out of habit. Life moved in its familiar rhythm. Then came Saturday. The destruction wasn't random or partial. It was thorough, deliberate, and utterly incomprehensible. The damage suggested not a single invasion, but sustained access. The intruders, plural, definitely plural, had spent time in the garden. They'd uprooted entire plants, not snapped them off at the stem, but pulled them completely, leaving holes and scattered root systems. The raised beds showed signs of excavation. The herb section had been trampled, plants crushed beneath small feet. The worst was the tomato section. Nearly half his plants had been damaged. Some pulled from the ground, others stripped of fruit, green tomatoes, ripening tomatoes, the sungolds that were just beginning to perfection. They weren't eaten, they were scattered, abandoned. This wasn't hunger, this was destruction for its own sake. Marcus stood in the middle of his devastated garden, his hands shaking, and felt something break inside him. It wasn't just anger, though there was plenty of that. It was a violation he couldn't quite articulate. This wasn't his property being damaged. This was him being damaged. Someone had reached into the thing that sustained him and torn it apart. The police came because he called them, though he had no evidence beyond the footprints and the damage itself. Officer Patterson, a woman in her 40s with a tired face, took photos and asked questions. Did he have neighbors? Any complaints between them? Any issues with local kids? No, Marcus said. No issues. No one uses this street. It's quiet. Patterson took down his information and promised to increase patrol. She gave him a pamphlet on neighborhood watch programs. She didn't say it, but her expression communicated clearly. This was neighborhood kids. They'd found a weakness and exploited it. Marcus spent the next 5 days repairing and replanting. He moved heaven and earth, literally shovel by shovel, to restore what he could. Some plants were gone for the season. The rare brandywines he'd been nursing for 3 years, the Cherokee purples just beginning to fruit, all decimated. He planted new seeds from his stored stock, knowing he wouldn't see mature fruit from most of them before autumn. The fence he rebuilt again, this time with wire reinforcement driven into concrete footers. He added a secondary gate with a more sophisticated lock. He installed motion sensor lighting on both rear corners and had a camera installed by a local security company, positioning it to capture anyone approaching the fence. The system would work, he told himself. The system would protect what was his. He was wrong about how much he needed that to be true. The second invasion came 2 weeks later. This time the camera caught them, 5 children ranging from what looked like 6 to maybe 12 years old. They moved with the calculated stealth of kids who understood they were doing something wrong. They came through the same section of fence where they'd somehow, impossibly, defeated the wire and the reinforced posts. The bolts had been methodically loosened. The concrete had been dug around. On the footage, they looked almost purposeful. The oldest one, a dark-haired girl with a hardness in her face that disturbed Marcus, directed the others. She pointed at plants to pull. She showed them how to maximize damage while remaining quick. They took 17 minutes from fence breach to exit. In that time, they destroyed approximately 40% of what remained of the season's planting. Marcus reported it to the police again, showed them the security footage, and this time Officer Patterson's expression shifted. This wasn't random vandalism. This was targeted. This was personal. "Do you recognize any of these kids?" she asked, studying the screen. Marcus shook his head. He didn't know children. He'd never married, never had nieces or nephews nearby. Kids were abstract creatures to him, small, loud, unpredictable. "I can canvass the neighborhood," Patterson said, "but honestly, without a clear identification, without witnesses, it's going to be hard to prove who specifically did this." "They're on camera," Marcus said, hearing the desperate edge in his own voice. "They are," Patterson agreed. "But kids have parents, and parents have lawyers. If you press charges and it goes to court without solid identification, it falls apart. What I can do is print copies of these still frames and show them around. Sometimes that's enough to scare parents into reining in their kids." It seemed like a reasonable approach. Marcus agreed. Patterson promised a neighborhood visit within 48 hours. Karen Morrison appeared on Marcus's doorstep on a Thursday morning, with her hands on her hips, and her face already arranged in the expression of someone preparing to be aggrieved. Marcus had been outside, assessing the fence damage and contemplating a complete replacement, when he noticed her at the property line. She was a woman in her mid-40s with the kind of blonde highlights that spoke of expensive monthly maintenance and the kind of resting face that suggested she rarely smiled. Behind her stood a girl of about 10 with a distinctive dark hair and a defiant expression. The same girl from the security footage, Marcus was certain. "Are you the one spreading lies about my children?" Karen called across the lawn, not bothering with a greeting. Marcus straightened slowly. He kept his voice level. "I reported a vandalism incident to the police with evidence, security footage." "Officer Patterson showed me," Karen said, stepping closer. "Those aren't even clear pictures, could be any kids. You're harassing my daughter, accusing her without proof, and I'm going to tell you right now, I don't appreciate it." Marcus looked at the girl who was watching him with an expression of pure triumph. She'd won already, he could see it in her face. She'd anticipated this, orchestrated it somehow. The mother was a tool she was wielding. "I have security footage," Marcus said again carefully. "From my camera, it's clear enough to identify the individuals involved." "It's clear enough to be a bunch of blurry pictures," Karen shot back. "And even if those were my kids, which they weren't, you're the one who has a fence. A fence says, keep out. What does it expect? If you're going to build a prison wall around your property, people are going to be curious. It's natural." Marcus felt something rise in his chest, a pressure, a heat. He forced it down. "Your children destroyed plants worth thousands of dollars, rare heirloom varieties, years of cultivation." "Plants," Karen repeated, drawing the word out. "You're upset about plants. It's a garden. It grows back. Kids being kids, that's normal, healthy behavior. Curiosity about what their neighbor is hiding behind a wall, that's natural." "They're not curious," Marcus said, and his voice came out colder than he intended. "They're destructive." Karen's face hardened. "My daughter Chelsea is a straight-A student. She's gifted and talented. She does not need to sneak around vandalizing your vegetables. We have our own vegetables at home." "Then they have no reason to be in my garden." "And I'm telling you they haven't been. You can't prove otherwise, and frankly, I think you're being obsessive about this. It's just a fence and a garden, Marcus. Let it go." She left before he could respond, the girl trailing behind with a smirk on her face. Marcus stood in his yard, breathing hard, and understood with absolute clarity that this would escalate. It did. Over the next week, the harassment began in earnest. KARENS complaints came in three simultaneous directions: Officer Patterson, the Homeowners Association, and a letter to Marcus's own address alleging that the security camera was pointed at the Morrison property and violated their privacy. The Morrison house is not visible from that angle, Marcus tried to explain to Patterson, who was now clearly tired of being caught in the middle. I understand, Patterson said, but Morrison has filed a complaint and her husband is a lawyer. He's threatening privacy violation suits if the camera isn't repositioned. Honestly, it might be easier just to take it down. Marcus didn't take it down. He repositioned it to capture only his property boundary, which meant losing the critical angle on the fence breach point. It was a strategic loss, and he knew it. The Homeowners Association sent a violation notice about the fortress-like appearance of his fence, claiming it violated the neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. They demanded he reduce the height or remove sections. Marcus knew the rules, he'd studied them when he moved in, and the fence was in compliance. He sent a letter stating this fact with photographs and measurements. Karen fired back with her own letter claiming that the fence created a safety hazard by obstructing sight lines and that the lack of transparency suggested the property was being used for illegal cultivation. She never came out and said it, but the implication was clear: drugs. It was vicious enough to make Marcus understand that he'd made an enemy of someone who knew how to weaponize bureaucracy. Then came the second-to-last straw. Marcus was returning from the farmer's market on a Saturday morning when he found Karen in his driveway, talking on her cell phone and taking pictures of his fence, his gate, his property. When she saw him, she didn't look embarrassed. She looked satisfied. I'm documenting everything, she said, hanging up her call. For the HOA, for the police, for when this goes legal. That fence is a menace, and you're using this property as a base for some kind of obsessive, controlling behavior. My kids are terrified of you. Your kids have destroyed my garden twice, Marcus said, surprised by how calm his voice sounded. That's not proven. It's on video. Blurry video, and you know what? Even if it was them and it wasn't, so what? Kids do things. You were a kid once, weren't you? You never did anything destructive. Marcus had been a very obedient, rule-following child. He'd still been that way at 56 years old. The idea that childhood mischief was equivalent to deliberate destruction of thousands of dollars worth of carefully cultivated plants seemed not just wrong but obscene. I want you off my property, he said. It's a public driveway, Karen said, but she moved toward her car anyway. And you should think about getting some help, Marcus, professional help. This obsession with a fence and a garden, it's not healthy, it's not normal. She drove away, and Marcus stood in his driveway with his farmer's market bags cooling in the sun and felt something crystallize inside him. The situation was no longer about his garden. It was about his sanity being questioned, his property being violated, his pursuit of something beautiful and meaningful being characterized as pathology. He spent that evening on his computer researching Karen Morrison, public records, social media, property information. He found her husband's law firm website. He found their home address and learned they'd bought their house for $487,003 years ago. He found Chelsea on Instagram. The account wasn't private, and watched videos of the girl being deliberately cruel to her younger brother, laughing at his distress, narrating his mistakes to her followers. The girl had 47,000 followers. Marcus closed the browser, feeling something like vertigo. The world was wrong. The calibration was broken. This girl, this child, had more influence and attention than Marcus could imagine. She created content from casual cruelty and was rewarded with followers and engagement. And when her actual, real-world cruelty, the destruction of his life's work, was documented, she was defended by her mother with arguments about natural curiosity and childhood mischief. He called Officer Patterson the next morning and asked if charges would be pressed. Not enough for a prosecutor to feel confident about, she said, and he could hear the apology in her voice. I'm sorry, Marcus. I know that's not what you want to hear, but without clear identification or witnesses or Karen admitting her kids did it, which she won't, we can't move forward. It's frustrating, I know. Marcus thanked her and hung up. He spent the next 3 days in a strange state of calm. He reinforced the fence again, this time with intention, not to keep people out but to keep something contained. He ordered specialized plants from rare growers, seeking out the most vulnerable, most delicate specimens he could find. He wanted his garden to be irresistible. He wanted the children to be unable to resist destroying it. On the fourth day, Chelsea Morrison, age 10, somehow breached the fence again. This time she did it alone. This time she was filming it. The video appeared on her Instagram at 2:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. Chelsea posing in Marcus's garden, making faces at the camera, intentionally stepping on plants, pulling flowers and tossing them aside with theatrical abandon. The caption read, "Lol, this guy has a literal wall around his plants like they're precious, or something face he's so mad face with tears of joy." The video got 4,300 likes in the first 3 hours. Marcus sat in his kitchen scrolling through the comments. "That man sounds toxic. Kids are just having fun. Honestly, he should relax." The fence is definitely giving psycho vibes, and felt something shift in his chest. Not just anger now, something darker, something that felt like justice, even though he knew justice wasn't what he was feeling. He knew what he was going to do, and he began to plan it with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made him an excellent accountant for 4 decades. He spent a week observing the Morrison household. Not hiding, he was careful not to do anything that could be construed as stalking in a literal, trespassing sense. But he drove past their house daily. He noted their patterns. KARENS left for work at 7:15 a.m. Her husband, David, worked from home but left for client meetings on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Chelsea attended Jefferson Elementary, 10 minutes away by car, and her school had early release on Wednesdays at 1:45 p.m. The younger brother, Tyler, was in a daycare program until 5 p.m. The garden invasions had always happened in the afternoon, when supervision was lax, when Chelsea had time to coordinate with her friends, when her parents assumed she was inside doing homework or watching television. The structural vulnerability existed on the Morrison end, not just the garden end. Chelsea had access and freedom because her parents believed in independence and trusted their daughter's judgment. That trust was about to become a weapon. Marcus began leaving his gate open on certain afternoons. He started small, a container of cookies he baked himself, placed conspicuously near the fence line, labeled for any neighbors who enjoy sweets. They sat untouched. He replaced them every other day, varying the offerings: brownies, snickerdoodles, Rice Krispies treats. On the 7th day they were gone. He could sense that Chelsea had taken them. He installed a new camera, positioned differently, at a higher angle. Not aimed at the Morrison property, perfectly compliant with their previous complaint, but oriented such that it captured the fence line and his gate from inside the garden. Then he waited for the weather to turn. Late August in Pennsylvania was unpredictable, prone to violent thunderstorms and humid, stagnant afternoons. When the forecast predicted a particularly bad storm for a Thursday afternoon, Marcus prepared. He'd been researching something specific, a particular variant of water hemlock, Cicuta douglasae, highly toxic, all parts dangerous but the roots especially. He couldn't obtain it locally, too much scrutiny, too obvious. He ordered it online to his locked mailbox at the UPS center across town, paying in cash using a secondary email account. It arrived in an unmarked brown box. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrible in its implications. He would not poison the children directly. That would be murder, and Marcus's moral code, twisted though it had become, couldn't quite extend that far. But he could create conditions. He could leave things accessible. He could trust, as KARENS always said, in natural curiosity. Children tested boundaries. Children explored. Children put things in their mouths. Didn't every parent live in fear of poisoning? Chocolate, plants, medications, mushrooms. He spent a Thursday evening processing the hemlock in his kitchen. He wore latex gloves. He was careful not to touch his face. He extracted what he needed and placed it in a small, unmarked garden pot. He mixed it with potting soil. He placed the pot in his garden near the fence line, where a curious child would see it and wonder what it was. Next to it, he placed a handwritten label he'd distressed to look old. "Experimental heirloom vegetable, do not touch, poisonous roots." The contradiction would be irresistible. Why would someone grow poisonous vegetables? What was the point? A child would have to investigate. He went to bed that night and slept the sleep of the damned. Friday morning, the pot remained undisturbed. He felt relief and something else, a flutter of hope that perhaps his better self would intervene. Perhaps he'd stop himself. Perhaps this was theater, and he was just venting in the safety of his own mind. But he didn't remove the pot. Friday afternoon, he stayed inside, watching on his laptop as the security feed showed Chelsea and two friends entering his garden. They had found his gate open again. They made a game of it, daring each other, laughing, their voices tinny through the camera's speaker. One of the friends, a blonde girl in pink shorts, spotted the marked pot and called the others over. "Don't touch poisonous roots," she read aloud, making her friends laugh. "Who grows poisonous vegetables?" Chelsea said, her voice carrying that characteristic mixture of disdain and obsession that Marcus had come to recognize. "Maybe he's growing them for his science experiment," the third child offered. Chelsea reached for the pot. Marcus watched, his finger hovering over the keyboard, knowing he could end this. He could close the gate remotely. He'd had it retrofitted with an electric lock. He could trap them, force confrontation, call the police himself, and report child trespassing. Instead, he watched as Chelsea lifted the pot, examined it, and carefully set it back down. "Gross," she said. "He's definitely crazy." They left 5 minutes later, the pot undisturbed. Marcus sat in the quiet of his home office, hands shaking, and realized something that both terrified and clarified him. He couldn't actually do it. Not even this much. Not even the setup. The line between righteous anger and actual harm, he couldn't cross it, and the impossibility of it filled him with a despair that was almost worse than the original violation. He went to his garden that evening and removed the pot. He buried the hemlock deep in the woods behind his property, 6 feet down, wrapped in plastic, marked only in his mind. He scrubbed his hands until they bled slightly at the cuticles. He sat on his garden bench, the spot where he'd spent countless peaceful hours, and wept with a fury that surprised him. The system had failed, the law had failed. His attempts at containment and protection had failed. The only path forward seemed to be destruction, and he wasn't capable of that, which meant he had no path at all. For 3 days, he barely left his house. He called into his accounting firm. Remote work was normal, had been since 2020, and told them he was taking personal days. He didn't attend the farmer's market. His regular customers would be confused, disappointed. He found he didn't care. On the 4th day, a Tuesday, a letter arrived from the Morrison family's law firm. It was a cease and desist regarding harassment. The letter, written in that particular language of legal threats, alleged that Marcus had been making threatening phone calls. He'd done no such thing. Recording private individuals without consent. His camera had been repositioned. Engaging in surveillance of a minor, watching his own property. Creating a hostile environment through harassment, reporting vandalism. The letter concluded that any further contact with the Morrison family, any further harassment, would result in legal action seeking damages and a restraining order. Marcus read it 3 times, carefully, with the eye of someone who had spent 40 years in a profession that dealt in detail and precision. It was a bluff. It had to be, but it was an effective one. Because even if he won, even if his camera footage and police reports proved his innocence of the alleged charges, the process itself would destroy him. The costs, the depositions, the assumption of guilt that would follow him in this neighborhood among these people. KARENS had understood this when she sent the letter. She'd weaponized the system in a way that was perfectly legal and perfectly destructive. Marcus called his lawyer, a man named Stevens who he'd known socially for years, and read him the letter. "It's harassment," Stevens said immediately. "The legal definition is narrow. What you did, reporting criminal activity, is protected. But I'll be honest with you, Marcus. Defending against this will cost money and time, and you'll still come out of it damaged. These people will press and press until you crack or give up or look unreasonable." "So what do I do?" "You could move," Stevens said quietly. "That might be the path of least resistance." 56 years old, 40-year mortgage, 1 year away from owning the property outright. The community he'd been part of, the garden he'd cultivated. The house his mother had visited in her final years before the cancer took her. No more lawn visits, no more HOA complaints, no more visible surveillance of Marcus's property. It was a calculated silence, Marcus understood. They'd established the boundary with teeth. Now they would let him stew in the fear of what might happen if he crossed it. The children stopped invading the garden. This was paradoxically worse than the invasions had been, because now Marcus spent his days in a state of hypervigilance, waiting for the breach that didn't come. His garden, though no longer physically damaged, became a prison of expectation. Every afternoon he waited. Every afternoon brought tension and then relief. The plants grew in the absence of threat, but they grew in a garden where joy had died. His regular customers at the farmer's market began to ask questions when he didn't return. "Where have you been?" Linda asked. She was a retired nurse who bought his tomatoes every week and made them into sauce. "Are you okay?" Marcus wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to describe the violation and the injustice and the way the system had aligned itself against him so completely that even defending himself was dangerous. Instead, he smiled and said he'd been dealing with personal matters. "Nothing serious, I hope," Linda pressed. "Just neighborhood stuff," he said. "Nothing for you to worry about." She looked at him with the expression people get when they recognize someone is lying to them but don't want to push. She bought 6 pounds of tomatoes anyway, and he saw the pity in her gesture. The farmer's market crowd was small and tight-knit. By the 3rd week of his absence, word had clearly spread. A couple of his regular customers approached Officer Patterson at the market and mentioned his absence. Patterson, feeling guilty about the case she couldn't prosecute, called Marcus to check on him. "Just needed a break," Marcus told her. "Garden maintenance, personal projects." He could hear the doubt in her silence. The break lasted 6 weeks. His plants continued to grow. Some reached peak maturity without him being present to harvest them. He found himself leaving ripe vegetables to rot on the vine, a sacrilege against everything he believed in. But the joy had gone out of it. Picking tomatoes felt like maintaining a memorial to something that was already dead. In late September, a man appeared at his door. Mid-60s, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being deferred to. David Morrison, Chelsea's father, the lawyer. "I wanted to check in," David said when Marcus opened the door, keeping it mostly closed. "Person to person, without the legal machinery." "I received your letter," Marcus said. "You did, and I believe you've respected the boundaries it established, which is good, which is what we want." David shifted his weight, and Marcus realized he was nervous. "Look, I'm going to be direct. My wife, Karen, doesn't understand people like you. People who are very focused, very particular. I do. I respect discipline and precision. I see it in my work every day. Your daughter destroyed my garden twice. I know Chelsea made a mistake. More than one, actually. She's been assessed by a therapist, something Karen and I thought was necessary. And the assessment is that Chelsea has some impulse control issues, some boundary testing behaviors that need addressing. We're working on it. New school, new structure, modified schedule." Marcus said nothing. "What I want to tell you," David continued, "is that Karen's response was disproportionate. The legal letter, the escalation, that wasn't necessary. And I think deep down you know that. I think you're a reasonable man who understands that children test boundaries and that sometimes parents overcorrect because they feel defensive about their parenting." The irony was almost funny. David Morrison was trying to convince Marcus that he, the man whose child had committed vandalism, was being unreasonable, that his response was disproportionate. "Your daughter filmed herself destroying my garden and posted it on social media," Marcus said. "Your wife came to my property and accused me of being obsessive about plants. I have security footage. I reported this to the police. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't do anything illegal." "And that's why I'm here," David said. "Because you didn't do anything illegal, because you've been reasonable. But Karen interprets that as weakness, as an opportunity to push further. If you'd been unreasonable, she'd back down. She respects aggression. She doesn't respect restraint." "I'm not interested in your family's dynamics," Marcus said. "I know, but I want to propose something. A resolution. My family is willing to reimburse you for the damage to your garden. Not just the immediate damage, but the cost of your labor, your time, your emotional distress. A sum that would make this go away." Marcus felt something inside him crystallize. "You're offering me money." "I'm offering you a resolution that doesn't involve legal action or further harassment." "The harassment stopped when your wife sent the cease and desist." "It will remain stopped," David said. "But lawsuits are expensive and time-consuming. This is a better path for everyone." Marcus closed the door. He didn't slam it. That would have been dramatic and satisfying. He simply closed it calmly while David Morrison was still speaking, still trying to negotiate. Through the peephole, Marcus watched as David stood on the stoop for another 30 seconds, processing the rejection. Then he walked back to his car, a black BMW, clean and recent and expensive, and drove away. Marcus realized in that moment that David Morrison's visit had been the beginning of something. Not an end, not a resolution, a shift. Because David had revealed something crucial, the Morrison family wanted this to go away. They wanted silence, settlement, a return to the state before the violation, which meant they understood at some level that what they'd done was wrong, that their daughter had transgressed, that KARENS' defense had been disproportionate. They wanted to pay him to forget. Marcus spent the next week in his home office, on the phone with Officer Patterson, with the local police chief, with his lawyer Stevens. He filed formal complaints again, but this time he focused on the cease and desist letter. He argued that it constituted harassment, an attempt to intimidate him from reporting a crime. He shared David Morrison's visit, documented it in writing, and suggested that the Morrison family was attempting to interfere with a police investigation through intimidation. Stevens was skeptical. "This is a stretch, Marcus." "Is it?" Marcus asked. "They committed a crime. They sent a threat to stop me from pursuing justice. Then they sent someone to offer a bribe disguised as a settlement. That's an escalating pattern of obstruction. It's also a family trying to protect their daughter, which is something juries understand and sympathize with." "Then what does the law mean?" Marcus asked, and even he could hear the desperation in his voice. Stevens was quiet for a moment. "It means you might be right, legally speaking, and it also might not matter, practically speaking. The law is a system run by humans, and humans are imperfect and biased. Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing are different." The conversation haunted Marcus for days. In October, the police closed the case. No charges would be filed. Officer Patterson delivered the news in person, and she looked genuinely sorry. "The DA reviewed the evidence," she said. "Security footage without clear identification plus a minor suspect plus a lack of additional corroborating evidence equals reasonable doubt. They won't prosecute." "There's a video of Chelsea Morrison destroying my garden," Marcus said. "Posted on the internet with her name tagged. That video proves someone destroyed plants. It doesn't definitively prove that person entered your property with intent to commit vandalism. It could be argued she was invited, she was exploring, she didn't understand the boundaries. With a good lawyer, and the Morrisons have a good lawyer, the prosecution would lose." After Patterson left, Marcus sat in his kitchen for 3 hours without moving. The sun set outside his window. The garden darkened. The system had consumed his complaint and rejected it. The law, which he had respected and followed and believed in for 56 years, had decided he was not worth defending. That night, Marcus did something he hadn't done in weeks. He went to his garden and took out the camera that had been positioned to capture the fence line. He carefully removed the footage from the past 3 months, all the invasions, all the destruction, all the evidence of the crime that the system had decided didn't matter. He encrypted the files and uploaded them to a private server he set up, accessible only through a password he created. He labeled the folder Insurance. November came to Oakwood Drive, bringing with it the specific kind of cold that penetrates through old houses and settles in the bones of people over 50. Marcus didn't run his heat in the daytime. He kept the thermostat at 58 degrees and wore sweaters, moving through his home like a ghost. The garden had entered its dormant season. The tomato plants were brown and dying back. The herbs were mostly gone. He'd pulled and composted what he could, and the beds sat bare, waiting for winter mulch. It was the season when most gardeners moved indoors, began planning next year's seeds, took stock of what had grown and what had failed. Marcus didn't do any of that. Instead, he began to research the Morrisons with the same meticulous attention he'd once directed towards soil composition and heirloom genetics. He investigated their finances, their social circles, their schedule. He learned that David made $340,000 a year at his law firm, that KAREN was a real estate agent with moderate success, that they'd financed the house with a $310,000 mortgage at 3.2% interest. He found their property tax records and learned the total value of their home and contents. He looked into Chelsea's social media more carefully. The girl had indeed been quiet since the cease and desist letter, but she'd also shifted her content. Instead of posting videos of herself being deliberately cruel or destructive, she was now posting aspirational content. Selfies at expensive restaurants, photos at her new private school, pictures of designer clothing. The shift was strategic. Someone, probably David, had coached her, clean up the image, remove the incriminating content, present as a victim if necessary. What Chelsea had not done was apologize. There was no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no understanding that she'd caused harm. There was only recalibration, repositioning, the manipulation of perception. It crystallized something in Marcus's understanding. The problem wasn't Chelsea's childhood cruelty or KARENS' defensiveness or David's attempts at settlement. The problem was that none of them, understood that what they had done was wrong at the level that mattered. They understood legality and strategy and public perception. They didn't understand harm. They didn't understand that some things, once destroyed, cannot be rebuilt exactly as they were. In mid-November, Marcus received a letter from the HOA. They were accepting his fence as compliant and closing the case. The letter was professional and polite, but it struck Marcus as a final insult. The Morrison family had used the HOA to harass him, and now that route had been exhausted, they simply released it without apology or acknowledgement. He also noted in reviewing his financial records that the farmer's market income had been meaningful. More than meaningful, it had been the structure of his social life and a supplement to his pension. By removing himself, he'd isolated both financially and socially. The market vendors had started to move on, new people were setting up in his spots. He was replaceable. One Tuesday morning, Marcus did something he hadn't done since August. He put vegetables in boxes and drove to the farmer's market. Linda was setting up her usual spot, and she did a double take when she saw him. "Marcus, where have you been? We've all been worried." "Family matters," he said, and there was truth in that. The Morrison family had become his family of concern, his daily focus. "I'm hopping to ease back in. Nothing crazy, just a few boxes for today." The market manager was happy to see him. His spot was still available. By mid-morning, he'd sold everything he brought and people were asking for more. He promised to be back the following week. As he was packing up, a man approached him. Someone Marcus didn't recognize, late 50s, weathered-looking. "You're the guy," the man said without preamble. "On Oakwood, the garden." Marcus's instinct was to tense, to prepare for confrontation. Instead, he forced himself to remain calm. "Yes. My daughter goes to Jefferson Elementary," the man said. "Comes home talking about some kid who uploads videos of being mean to people. Says the kid goes to school now but has all these followers and the other kids think it's cool to be like her. To be cruel because it gets attention." Marcus wasn't sure what to say. "My wife and we've tried to talk to the school about it, about the bullying culture this kid was encouraging. The school basically shrugged and said social media was a parental issue. But it's not just parental, is it? When one kid influences 40,000 other people to think being mean is entertainment." He trailed off, looking at Marcus. "I heard she destroyed your garden, that her mother went to the police and made it go away. That's not right." "No," Marcus agreed quietly, "it's not." The man nodded and walked away. Marcus stood in the cool November morning, holding empty vegetable boxes, and felt something shift in his understanding. He wasn't alone in recognizing that the Morrisons had escaped accountability. He wasn't crazy or obsessive. He was simply the person who'd been victimized and who'd had the system fail them spectacularly. That evening, Marcus created a blog. It was sparse and anonymous. A username, a generic template, a single post. The post was titled "When Vandalism Goes Unpunished," a neighborhood story, and it detailed with careful precision and no names the invasion of his garden, the destruction of his plants, the police report, and the family's response. He included the Instagram screenshot of the girl posting the video. He described the cease and desist letter and David Morrison's attempt at settlement. He did not name anyone. He did not make accusations. He simply told the truth. He promoted the blog on local neighborhood Facebook groups, on Nextdoor, on any community forum where the post wouldn't immediately violate rules. "Wanted to share a cautionary tale about home security and how violations are handled in our area," he wrote. The engagement was immediate. Within 12 hours, the post had been shared 400 times. People were asking questions. What neighborhood? What family? What was the girl's social media handle? They wanted details, specifics, the kind of information that would let them identify and judge for themselves. Marcus didn't provide names. He didn't have to. The description was detailed enough. The combination of Oakwood Drive, cease and desist from the family of a lawyer, and girl with 47,000 Instagram followers was specific enough that anyone on those forums would start investigating and cross-referencing. By day 2, someone had identified Chelsea Morrison by name in the comments. By day 3, the Morrison family's phone was ringing with people calling to voice their disapproval of the girl's behavior. By day 4, Chelsea's Instagram follower count had dropped from 47,000 to 38,000, and parents were leaving scathing comments about her influence on their children. By day 5, the cease and desist letter arrived at Marcus's house, updated to include threats about defamation and false light invasion of privacy. Marcus read it calmly and sent a copy to Stevens. "You didn't name anyone," Stevens confirmed. "No. You didn't make false statements. Everything I wrote is true." Stevens sighed. "You made a tactical mistake. This blog post, true or not, whether they can prove defamation or not, this is going to escalate things. You understand that? You've moved from being a victim to being an aggressor." Marcus understood perfectly. That had been precisely the intention. The Morrison family didn't take Marcus to court over the blog. Instead, they took him to court over something else entirely. On a cold Friday morning in December, Marcus answered a knock on his door to find a bailiff serving him with papers. He was being sued for $50,000 in damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress. KARENS Morrison's deposition, the details of which Stevens obtained and shared with Marcus, described the harassment campaign, the security camera which had been repositioned at her request, the blog post which had led to harassment of her daughter, the implicit targeting of her family in the community forums. She described how Chelsea had become depressed, how she'd been bullied at school by other children who'd learned about her from the blog post, how the family's privacy had been violated. The deposition did not address the garden destruction. It did not address the police report. It focused entirely on Marcus's retaliation and framed him as the aggressor. Stevens reviewed the case. "This is actually a decent legal strategy," he said, rubbing his temples. "They're claiming emotional distress. They don't have to prove it caused damages in the traditional sense. They can argue the distress itself is the damage, and depending on the judge, it could potentially stick." "But Chelsea broke into my property and destroyed plants she posted about online," Marcus said. "Legally irrelevant if the judge determines that your response was disproportionate and designed to cause emotional harm." Marcus felt something break inside his chest. The system was designed so that even when you told the truth, even when you were the victim, defending yourself could be reframed as aggression. You could not fight back without becoming guilty. "What should I do?" he asked Stevens. "Settle," Stevens said immediately. "Whatever they want, whatever they're willing to accept, take it. The court costs alone could reach $30,000 to $40,000. Even if you win, you lose financially. And judges are unpredictable. I wouldn't want to risk your savings on this." "How much would a settlement be?" "Probably in the $10,000 to $15,000 range, given the damages they're claiming." Marcus had that money. His pension was modest, but he had savings. 40 years of responsible financial decisions. Not wealth, but security. A settlement of $15,000 would be significant but not catastrophic. What was catastrophic was the principle. What was catastrophic was paying people to leave him alone while they remained unaccountable for what they'd done. "Let me think about it," Marcus said. He spent the next week in a state of suspended animation. The plants were all dormant now. The garden was bare and sleeping. He moved through his house, through his life, as if underwater. A book was published about a man who planted a forest as an act of love and patience and faith. Marcus found himself identifying not with the man, but with the forest, existing in a place, deepening roots, only to have everything torn up by forces beyond his control. On a Tuesday afternoon, while Marcus was sitting in his kitchen trying to force himself to eat, his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Is this Marcus Webb?" A woman's voice, young, tentative. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Rachel Chen. I'm a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'm working on a story about social media influence and bullying, and your case came up in my research. I wanted to see if you'd be willing to talk." Marcus's first instinct was to say no, but he stopped himself. "What kind of story?" "A profile piece about how children with large social media followings influence their peers. and the real-world consequences of their behavior. Your incident with the garden vandalism seemed relevant because it involves a minor with significant social media influence engaging in destructive behavior, and then the family's subsequent response when that was documented. "They're suing me for defamation," Marcus said. "I know. That's actually part of what makes this interesting. It's a broader question. When victims try to expose harm, how does the perpetrator's family use legal threats to silence them? It's a pattern that's repeated again and again, and usually the person being silenced is someone with less resources than the people doing the silencing." Marcus considered this. "Can I think about it?" "Of course, here's my card. I'd love to talk, but it's entirely your choice." After they hung up, Marcus looked at the card. Rachel Chen, staff reporter, social justice and community investigations. A real journalist, not someone on a neighborhood forum asking for details, not someone with a grievance, someone whose job was to dig into stories like this. He called her back the next morning. The interview took place at a coffee shop, neutral territory. Rachel was younger than Marcus expected, maybe 30, with sharp eyes and a notebook that she filled with rapid, efficient notes. "Tell me everything," she said. "Start from the beginning." Marcus did. He described the garden, his passion for it, the invasions, the destruction. He described his attempts to work through the system, the police report, the security footage. He described the cease and desist letter and David Morrison's visit. He described the blog post and the immediate retaliation with the lawsuit. Rachel listened without interrupting, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Marcus finished, she set down her pen. "This is a clear example of SLAPPing," she said. "Strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's a real phenomenon. Someone makes a statement, even a true statement, and the other party sues them not necessarily to win, but to drain resources and create fear in other potential speakers. It's abuse of the legal system to silence victims." "Is it illegal?" "In some states, yes. Pennsylvania has anti-SLAPP laws, but they're limited. Your lawyer should absolutely file a motion to dismiss on anti-SLAPP grounds. It's your best defense." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly, but a kind of clarity. He wasn't crazy. The system wasn't just broken in his case. It was being weaponized intentionally by people who understood its vulnerabilities. "Will you write the story?" he asked. Rachel considered him. "I want to," she said, "but I need to verify some details independently. The police report, the cease and desist letter, the lawsuit papers, and I'll need to reach out to the Morrison family for comment, which means they'll know what's coming." "They already know," Marcus said. "They're suing me." "True, but this will escalate things. This will make it national, not neighborhood. Are you prepared for that?" Marcus wasn't sure, but he thought about Chelsea Morrison, about the 47,000 followers before her follower count dropped. He thought about the girl's refusal to understand that she'd done something wrong, that actions had consequences. He thought about a system that punished victims for defending themselves. The Philadelphia Inquirer article, published on a Wednesday morning in mid-December, with a headline that made the Morrisons visible to the world. "When social media stars vandalize and their families sue to silence. One man's fight against digital-age bullying and legal intimidation." Rachel Chen's reporting was thorough and devastating. She'd interviewed Marcus extensively. She'd obtained copies of the cease and desist letter through court records. She'd even managed to get statements from Officer Patterson about the case. Not official statements, but off-the-record comments about how frustrating it was that vandalism involving a minor couldn't be prosecuted. She'd also done what Marcus hadn't. She'd identified the Morrison family by name. She'd included photographs from their public real estate listings. She'd included Chelsea's Instagram handle and described the content of her posts, not to shame the girl, but to establish context. This was a child with genuine influence, and that influence had been used in ways that encouraged cruel behavior. The article was careful, legally precise, and absolutely devastating to the Morrison family's narrative. Within 4 hours of publication, Chelsea Morrison's Instagram account was suspended for violations of the platform's community guidelines. Within 8 hours, her follower count, which had been recovering, had dropped to 8,000 and was falling. Parents were flooding the comments with screenshots of her old posts, discussing the bullying behavior, warning other parents. Within 12 hours, Her private school issued a statement that they were reviewing Chelsea's enrollment status based on the article's revelations about her behavior and her family's legal tactics. The reaction was immediate and thorough. David Morrison called Marcus's lawyer directly, demanding that Marcus retract the statements and cease all public discussion. Stevens told him to put it in writing and hung up. 3 hours later, David sent an email, copied to his own counsel, which Stevens correctly identified as an attempt to negotiate a settlement under pressure. "They're panicking," Stevens told Marcus. "The national attention is the last thing they wanted. A local neighborhood issue is manageable. A published story in a major newspaper about family dysfunction and legal intimidation is not." "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Either they drop the lawsuit and offer a significant settlement, or they proceed and risk the lawsuit itself becoming fodder for Rachel Chen's follow-up reporting. Neither is good for them." By day 3 after publication, the Morrison family's lawyer, a different one than David had contacted Marcus with, made an offer. They would drop the lawsuit entirely in exchange for a mutual non-disparagement agreement. Marcus would not discuss the Morrison family in any public forum. They would not sue. It would be finished. Stevens called it a trap. "They're trying to silence you after the fact. After you've already said what you needed to say, they want your agreement to stop talking as part of the record." "But if I agree, they drop the lawsuit," Marcus said. "They should drop it anyway. The lawsuit is their problem, not yours. You're the victim here." Marcus declined the offer. The Morrison family countered by offering to drop the lawsuit and pay Marcus $20,000 as a gesture of goodwill and a desire to put this behind them. Stevens shook his head. "They're desperate. The article has damaged them significantly. The school is likely going to expel Chelsea. Their friends and family are distancing themselves. David's law firm is probably receiving calls from clients asking if they want to work with a firm whose founder engages in these practices. They're in crisis management mode." "So what do I do? What do you want to do?" Marcus thought about his garden. He thought about the violation, the destruction, the absolute betrayal of the system. He thought about Chelsea Morrison's face in that Instagram video, her expression of triumph and cruelty. "I want them to understand what they did was wrong," he said. "That's not a legal strategy," Stevens said gently. "That's a human desire and it's understandable, but the law isn't designed to produce understanding. It's designed to produce outcomes." "Then what outcome would satisfy you?" Marcus asked. Stevens was quiet for a moment. "An apology from Chelsea. A genuine one, not a public relations move. David and KARENS both taking responsibility. Some actual consequence that produces learning rather than just damage control." "Will they do that?" "No," Stevens said, "because consequences are what they're designed to avoid. The lawsuit, the legal maneuvering, that's how they avoid consequences. And now that the lawsuit is clearly becoming their problem rather than yours, they'll try to minimize the fallout." By day 6 after the article, Chelsea's private school had issued a statement that she was being expelled for violation of their conduct code. The school also stated that they were implementing new social media policies for students. David Morrison resigned from his law firm 2 days later, citing personal reasons and a desire to focus on family matters. KARENS Morrison's real estate license came under investigation by the Pennsylvania Department of State for potential violations related to using her professional status to harass a neighbor. The Morrison family home received a significant number of angry letters and occasional protesters in their driveway. Nothing violent, nothing explicitly threatening, but visible social consequences for behavior that they'd believed was private and protected. It was this, the visible social consequence, that broke through. On the 10th day after the article, David Morrison contacted Stevens directly and asked for a call with Marcus present. The conversation happened on a Friday afternoon, with Stevens facilitating from his office while Marcus sat in his kitchen with his phone on speaker. "I want to offer an apology," David said, and his voice was entirely different from before. Not confident, not strategic. Broken. Not for legal reasons, not for the sake of appearance, but because I've realized in the last 10 days that my family's response to a situation where my child made a serious mistake was to double down, to blame, to lawyer up instead of addressing what happened. Marcus said nothing, waiting. "Chelsea destroyed your garden. She posted about it on social media. My wife's response was to protect her rather than hold her accountable. My response was to minimize the situation and try to make it go away legally. And in doing so, we harmed you further, and we taught Chelsea that actions don't have consequences, that the right response to being caught is to silence the person who caught you. There was a pause. She's in therapy now, David continued. A real therapist who's telling her some hard truths. She understands now that she caused harm. She wants to apologize to you in person, but I also understand if you don't want that, if you just want to be left alone. Marcus found he couldn't speak. The apology felt like air in a room he'd been suffocating in. I want to offer you restitution, not as a settlement, but as actual restitution. I've calculated the cost of your destroyed plants, your labor, the depreciation of your garden's productivity. The amount is $18,700. I also want to commit to ensuring Chelsea understands the full weight of what she did. She's writing you a letter, not for legal purposes, just a letter that she needs to send. After the call ended, Marcus sat in his quiet kitchen and felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness, exactly, not closure, but something like the possibility of moving forward. 3 weeks later, on a cold Saturday morning just before Christmas, Chelsea Morrison came to Marcus's door. She was smaller than he expected, worn down by the events of the past month. She was alone, which suggested her parents had wisely recognized that she needed to face this on her own. "Hi," she said, and her voice was so small that Marcus almost didn't hear it. "I'm Chelsea." Marcus stepped aside. "Come in." They sat in his kitchen, not the living room. The kitchen was where he lived, where he existed. It felt more honest somehow. Chelsea had a letter. She read it aloud, and while some of the phrasing was clearly assisted by therapy or a careful parent, the core of what she was saying seemed genuine. "I destroyed your garden on purpose because I thought it was funny," she read. "I didn't think about how much work you put into it. I didn't think about how it would make you feel. I only thought about how many people would watch and like my videos. I was wrong. It wasn't funny. It was mean, and I caused real harm to something you cared about." She paused, her voice thickening. "You didn't do anything to deserve that. You didn't deserve for my mom to defend me or to pretend it didn't happen. You deserved for me to apologize and to face real consequences. I lost my followers and got expelled from school, and I deserve those things. They helped me understand how serious this was." She looked up at Marcus. "I'm sorry, genuinely sorry, for invading your space, for destroying your plants, for not understanding that my actions had real consequences." Marcus found he was crying, not from anger anymore, but from something like relief. The words mattered. The understanding mattered. It didn't undo the damage, but it acknowledged the damage, and that acknowledgement was something the system had been unable to provide. "Thank you for saying that," he said, "for understanding." After Chelsea left, Marcus went to his garden. The soil was dormant, waiting. The beds were bare. The season was wrong for most things, but there were some cold-weather crops that might survive. He would replant. He would reclaim this space. Not because the harm hadn't happened, it had, but because the acknowledgement of the harm meant that his story didn't end with a violation and a failed system. The restitution money came through the first week of January. Marcus used it to not just restore his garden, but to transform it. He built new raised beds with deeper soil. He invested in better infrastructure. He purchased rare seeds and heirloom varieties that he'd never dared to grow before. He returned to the farmer's market on a cold Tuesday morning, and Linda was there waiting. "I read the article," she said, pulling him into an unexpected hug. "I'm glad you fought. I'm glad people know." The story of his garden and the Morrison family became one of those things that moved beyond local news into something broader. It was featured in think pieces about bullying and accountability. It was mentioned in academic papers about SLAPPing and legal intimidation. Chelsea Morrison's case was cited in discussions about social media influence and child responsibility. More importantly, it shifted something in the perception of the Morrison family. David gradually rebuilt his career in a smaller firm. Karen left real estate and went back to school for something else. Chelsea, expelled from her private school, ended up at public school where she had to rebuild her social standing from scratch, without followers, without influence, just as a regular kid who'd made serious mistakes. She sent Marcus a letter every year on the anniversary of the garden destruction, detailing her progress, her understanding of what she'd done, her commitment to not repeating those patterns. The letters evolved from formal and assisted to more genuine and self-aware. By the third year, she was volunteering at a community garden and writing about her experience with accountability and consequences. Marcus never responded to the letters directly, but he framed the first one and hung it in his kitchen, a reminder of what justice actually looked like. Not punishment, but understanding. Not silence, but acknowledgement. His garden grew more beautiful with each passing season. The tomatoes he cultivated that first year after the reckoning were the finest he'd ever grown. Not because they were different varieties or because he used different techniques, but because he grew them in a garden that had been acknowledged, that had been respected, that had been restored through an actual reckoning with harm. On a warm Tuesday morning the following June, Marcus was at the farmer's market with his boxes of vegetables when a man approached him. He was in his 60s, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd come to learn something. "I heard your story," the man said. "In one of those articles about resilience and community response. I wanted to thank you." "Thank me for what?" Marcus asked. "For not giving up, for fighting even when it seemed the system was against you, for proving that speaking the truth, even when retaliation follows, can produce real consequences for real harm. My own daughter was bullied last year, and I was prepared to let it go to tell her that's just how the world works. But I read about you, and it changed how I approached things. I'm grateful for that." After the man left, Marcus arranged his tomatoes carefully in their boxes, and he felt something like peace for the first time in over a year. The garden had been violated, the system had failed, but in the end, he had chosen not to become the monster that the violation tempted him to become. He had chosen exposure over retaliation, truth over silence, accountability over destruction. And the world, imperfectly and incompletely, but genuinely, had responded. The Morrisons never again approached his property. They never sent threatening letters. They never attempted to interfere with his life. They had been held accountable not by a court. Courts rarely achieve this, but by the simple act of exposure and by their community's response to that exposure. Marcus had wanted to poison his garden to harm children. He had been ready to commit violence in the name of justice. But somewhere in the process of actually having to act on that impulse, he had chosen differently. He had chosen to tell the truth and trust that the truth, even when weaponized against him, would eventually produce the right outcome. It had been a close call, a moment where he might have become something irredeemable, but he had stepped back from that edge. As he walked through his garden on summer mornings, tending his plants, grateful for their growth and resilience, Marcus understood that this restoration through accountability rather than destruction, was justice as close as the human system could get to perfect.